And it gives me great pleasure first to introduce Professor Sandra Brucet from the University of Vic in Spain, who is leading the PONDERFUL project. And she's going to be giving the first of today's presentations, introducing you to the project to talk about its overall aims and objectives. So Sandra, I will hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Jeremy and Tobias, for this nice introduction and welcoming. As the coordinator of the PONDERFUL project and on behalf of the whole consortium, I would like to thank you very much, all of you, for joining us in the launch of our project. It's really nice to see how many people is interested in ponds and small waters in general. And we really hope that you will enjoy the presentations of this afternoon. So now I'm going to share you the screen. Okay, so I guess that now you can see it. Is it fine?
Yes.
I do not, okay, because I do not see the faces. So I'm going to introduce this wonderful project that, as Jeremy mentioned, it's an Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation project funded by the European Commission, and that started already last December and will last for 4 years. And as far as we know, PONDERFUL, it's the largest European research project so far tackling the conservation and ecology of ponds and their role in climate change mitigation. You can see here that we are a big consortium composed of 18 partners in total from 11 countries. 8 of them are European countries: Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, France, Spain, and Portugal. And there are also 3 partners from UK, 1 from Turkey, and 1 from Uruguay. And here I only included the IPs from the different institutions, but there are many more participants involved with different backgrounds and areas of expertise that goes from ecology, pond conservation, modeling, social and political sciences, environmental economics, etc. As you probably know, and Leonor will explain us later in her talk, it was traditionally assumed that large habitats like rivers or lakes were key for freshwater biodiversity conservation, and that the small size of ponds made them less important. However, unfortunately, the research over the last 15 to 20 years is changing this perception, because it shows that ponds are one of the most abundant and richest freshwater habitats, representing 30 to 50% of the standing waters worldwide, and they have proved to be critical for they have proved to be critical biodiversity hotspots, an important refuge for rare plants and animals. In Europe, for example, ponds support up to 70% of the regional species pool, and there are studies that show that ponds have more rare, endemic, and threatened species than rivers or lakes. The ponds also deliver multiple ecosystem services, including provisioning of water, flood control, groundwater recharge, pollution amelioration, recreation, tourism, etc. And although there is little knowledge on the role that ponds and small water bodies in general play in mitigating climate change, the few studies that exist show that they may have a significant role in carbon sequestration, but also on emissions. Yeah, okay. I think I'm not sure if the slides are changing automatically. Maybe I will have to stop for a moment, but I continue. However, in spite of the great importance of ponds, they have been largely neglected in European policies related to water and nature, including the Water Framework Directive, that for most countries set a limit of 15 hectares to the water bodies that it applies. There are also sections of ponds being included in EU directive. For example, some Mediterranean temporary ponds, which are included in the Habitat Directive as priority habitats because of the plant species that live in them. And the fact that ponds are largely omitted from monitoring programs and EU directive is, of course, really problematic, because ponds are exposed to the same threats that face large waters, like land use or water use or pollution. and they may be particularly vulnerable to climate change because they are less buffered to temperature extremes and changes in hydrology. In fact, in most European countries, the number of ponds has declined a lot over the past century, with losses over 50% in many European countries and occasionally reaching 90%, for example, in Netherlands, Switzerland, or some parts of Germany. And this concern was highlighted by IBES in the regional assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services for Europe and Central Asia. The same assessment also highlighted the lack of freshwater biodiversity data, particularly invertebrates, as a critical knowledge gap for biodiversity conservation. Additionally, although ponds have multiple functions, they are not it's changing automatically, sorry. So I was saying that, that although ponds have multiple functions, they are not commonly applied as nature-based solutions. And this is due to barriers and challenges that hamper their development and management, such as knowledge gaps on the policy or and the social context of ponds, or knowledge gaps on the costs and benefits of pond implementation as nature-based solution. Okay. So with all this background in mind, we designed the Ponderful Project with the main objective to provide data and guidance to make more and better use of ponds and pondscapes, so the networks of ponds, as nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation and adaptation, biodiversity conservation, and delivery of ecosystem services. And we will do this by generating and integrating biodiversity, ecosystem, social, economic, and policy knowledge, and by providing also evidence-based guidance and tools for pond nature-based solution implementation. So the specific aims of Ponderful are, first of all, to develop an approach to strongly engage with the stakeholders, so as to be sure that they are able to implement the benefit of ponds as nature-based solutions. Ponderful will also evaluate the interactions and feedbacks between biodiversity, ecosystem services, and climate in ponds. And this is being done by generating new data of biodiversity and ecosystem services of ponds at multiple spatial scales. Ponderful is also developing models to predict the impact of climate change on biodiversity and ecosystem services for different land uses and pondscape scenarios. Another important objective is to develop and test the implementation of pond nature-based solution in close collaboration with the stakeholders, and this will be done by creating a set of demonstration sites across Europe where pond nature-based solutions are already implemented. And finally, of course, we will make sure that the outputs of Ponderful are widely known by policymakers, practitioners, and stakeholders. And above all, one of the Ponderful objectives is to provide data for supporting the recommendation from this review paper that you see on the screen, recently published by Van Ries et al. About the new global biodiversity framework. And I quote what the paper says. New strategies that should address the bias in research management and policy principally focus on rivers and lakes and largely excluding other freshwater habitats. So Ponderful aims to provide critical data and policy support to address the bias this bias that exists towards large water bodies. And how are we going to do all this? Ponderful it is structured in these four different parts that you see on the screen. This different forward package. We have our package focused on the involvement of stakeholders, policy, socioeconomics, and sustainable financing. Another one that is focusing on the effects of climate change on biodiversity, ecosystem functions, and services and their interactions. One on scenarios and modeling the impacts of climate change. And another one using ponds as nature-based solutions to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So and I will present you these four work packages of Ponderful. As I said, one of the Work packages is focused on the stakeholder involvement, policy, socioeconomics, and sustainable financing. And here, our main aim is to develop a multidimensional framework that supports the effective, efficient, and equitable implementation of pondscapes as nature-based solutions. This first work package is very important because ponds are affected by socioeconomic factors, which include policy, economic incentive, or the perceptions that the society has about ponds. And all these socioeconomic factors can drive the protection of pondscapes, but they can also place barriers. So the main aim of this work package is to understand how policy, economics, and the public perceptions affect ponds, and to identify how we can use these factors to increase the implementation of pondscapes as nature-based solutions. So the first task will be to explore the social perception of ponds and their importance for the delivery of ecosystem services, or what it's very similar, the nature contributions to people, that it's an approach proposed by IBES, which is very similar to ecosystem services. So by doing questionnaires, we're going to analyze how pondscapes as providers of ecosystem services are perceived by residents and stakeholders. Ponderful will also analyze the policy context of the ponds at different levels, from local to European scale, and will identify the enabling factors and the barriers for implementing pond nature-based solutions. And other important task will be to assess which are the instruments to finance pondscape nature-based solutions, and also analyze the economic context of ponds, focusing on the economic assessment of the risk associated to ponds nature-based solution. This is another work package of Ponderful, which is evaluating the interactions and feedbacks between biodiversity, ecosystem services, and climate in pondscapes at multiple spatial scales. And this work package will be explained in detail in the next presentation by Thomas Miner. So I will only introduce you here the main task, which are the following. So first of all, we are going to evaluate how pond biodiversity varies across a large climate gradient, including Europe and Uruguay. We will also document ecosystem functions and services of ponds and analyze the interrelations between biodiversity, ecosystem functions, and services across the climate gradient. And here we are particularly investing a lot of effort on the analysis of the greenhouse gas production and carbon trapping by ponds. We will also assess how hydroperiod shapes the interactions among biodiversity, ecosystem functions, and services. And finally, we will analyze the vulnerability, resistance, and resilience of pond biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services to climate change. So to achieve this objective, we are going to use different methods. We are going to compile a pan-European database of existing data on biodiversity, environmental conditions, and land use. We are also performing a large-scale stratified sampling in 8 countries across Europe and Uruguay, the ones that you see, these green numbers that you see in this map. And in each of these countries, we will perform the standardized sampling of 30 ponds, including both permanent and temporary ponds. And we will generate a data set on environmental conditions, biodiversity, and ecosystem functions that will be also used later to fit the modeling exercises to forecast the effects of climate change on pondscapes. There will also be specific case studies to address stability and the resilience of pond biodiversity and ecosystem functions to climate change that Thomas will explain you later. And finally, we will also use a long-term running experiment in Denmark, the Lemming experiment, to assess the effects of climate change on biodiversity and upon ecosystem functioning. So here you can see some nice pictures of the biodiversity sampling that it's taking place this spring in different countries. This has been an intense sampling, as you can imagine, but I think that we are all enjoying it a lot, and we surely the hard work will pay off These are some pictures of the biodiversity sampling in Denmark and Spain. Here, another picture of the biodiversity sampling in Switzerland. Another one on the EDNA sampling in UK. Here, the UK team sampling biodiversity under the rain. Sorry, and here the University of Vic and University of Girona team sampling the greenhouse gases in the ponds of Catalonia in Spain in better weather conditions. Here another picture of the details of the greenhouse gas chambers that we are using to analyze the gases continuously. This sampling will be repeated again this summer, even when the ponds are dry, and then again in autumn and winter. So another objective of Ponderful is it's being developed in parallel to the sampling, and it's the model and the development of a modeling framework to predict the impacts of climate change on biodiversity and ecosystem services for different land uses and pondscape scenarios. And here, the modelers will co-develop scenarios of pond management using information from the stratified sampling, as well as from the demonstration sites, which I later will show you. So to do so, they will take into account the stakeholder needs, the management strategies, and also the projected trends in land use and climate change. They will also develop an integrative and predictive modeling framework by incorporating the empirical relationships between biodiversity, ecosystem services, and connectivity, and the projections of climate change, hydrological change, and land use change. And finally, based on the modeling outputs and scenarios, and in co-development with the stakeholders also, Ponderful will produce priority maps for intervention. So the idea is to produce maps that will assess where the management of pondscapes would contribute most to biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation and adaptation. These priority areas for intervention will be, for example, regions where ponds will suffer higher impacts from climate change or land use, and so that will require, conservation measures to be put in place. Or, for example, regions where investing in better management may lead to greater climate mitigation. Another main objective of Ponderful, it's related to the use of ponds as nature-based solutions. And here we aim to develop guidance for planning and management of ponds as nature-based solutions, which will focus on the use of ponds for climate change adaptation and mitigation, delivery of ecosystem services and functions, and biodiversity conservation. So to achieve this objective, we have set up a network of demonstration sites in Europe and Uruguay, where pond nature-based solutions have already been implemented. And then we will develop a set of tools for decision makers and local practitioners to promote and guide implementation of these ponds nature-based solutions. Here, I will only briefly introduce you our work on the pond nature-based solutions and the demonstration sites. And later, Beato Arli will give you a presentation about this work package. So we have already selected the demonstration sites in 8 countries, in 8 European countries and Uruguay, where the pond nature-based solution have already been implemented. And you can see them in the map, the red dots. Each of these demo sites will be characterized in terms of its ecosystem services, biodiversity, economic benefits, and potential for mitigation of climate change. And then we will show how ponds can provide different ecosystem services or nature contribution to people following the approach developed by IPBES. And this nature contribution to people are, for example, those ones listed here in the slide, like the provision of clean water, new habitat creation, carbon trapping, pollination, etc. And finally, our final aim is to highlight the best practice strategies in the implementation of the pond nature-based solutions. So here you can see some of the selected demonstration sites. Beth will show you more later. This is the demo site in Belgium, where 16 ponds were restored, managed, or created. And these are the native contributions to people that this demo site provides. So similar to the ecosystem services that they provide. So this pondscape provide new habitats for increasing biodiversity in general, and they are also breeding sites for amphibians like the crested newt. People is using this demo site for hiking or for being in contact with nature. And also, finally, these ponds also have a buffer capacity. Here, there is another example. This is one of the demo sites in Spain, in Catalonia. And here, the nature-based solution implemented is the restoration of ponds. Specifically, with the aim to recover the ecological values of the salt marshes that you see in these pictures, and their capacity to buffer the effect of the marine intrusion during sea storms. Sorry. So here, the new ponds were created to provide habitat for the endemic Iberian tooth carp and eel. And they are also used by people to walk and be in contact with nature. And also, as I said, to buffer the effect of marine intrusions. And the ponds are also trapping carbon. More details and examples will be given by Beth in his presentation. So by developing all these objectives and tasks that I have introduced you, we expect that Ponderful will make significant impact in relation to pond biodiversity conservation, ecosystem service, and climate change mitigation and adaptation. And the impacts that we expect from Ponderful are summarized in these following slides. So the expected scientific impacts, some of the expected scientific impacts of Ponderful will be first, large-scale assessment of the critical role of ponds and pondscapes in maintaining freshwater biodiversity and climate resilience. Also, the quantification of the mechanistic links between pond biodiversity, ecosystem services, and climate. The quantification of the contribution of ponds for climate change mitigation and adaptation, which will be done by analyzing carbon storage and greenhouse emissions at different climates. The prediction of pond responses to climate change and land use scenarios, and the identification of the best practices for pond nature-based solution implementation. And finally, in relation to the societal and policy impact, Ponderful is investing a lot of effort on providing support for the recent work that demonstrates that the small habitats are far more important than traditionally considered. Particularly, we expect to show that better protection of ponds and small water bodies in general could help address the biodiversity crisis. Because ponds are biodiversity hotspots, because they are also stepping stone habitats, and because they provide critical habitats for uncommon and rare species. And also because ponds are small habitats, which makes them easy to manage and protect, and they are also cheap to make. So they provide major biodiversity gains with all investing modest expenses. Ponderful will also promote the integration of ponds into policies to reach biodiversity, ecosystem services, and climate change objective. And in this sense, we expect that the evidence from the project will help support refinements of the environmental policy. And last but not least, Ponderful will also provide the stakeholders with tools to use pondscapes as nature-based solutions to increase resilience of societies and ecosystems to global change. Or, as we say in Catalan, el pot petit i a la bona confitura, which translates literally into English as the best jam is in small jars. Thank you.